the inauguration of the International Association of Academicians for Peace, IAAP, Oceania chapter. Now, IAAP is one of the projects of UPF, Universal Peace Federation. The geographic region of Oceania is mainly ocean, of course, but is strategically vital for many nations, including the United States, its regional allies, China, and so on. In particular, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, the regional allies of the United States, they have an interest in expanding the democratic institutions and liberal norms, ensuring the commercial and military access across the Pacific remains free and unimpeded. The geopolitical importance of Oceania for both US and China is obvious, and the COVID-19 epidemic and the consequent economic catastrophe that it caused has exacerbated tensions between the United States and China, as well as with Australia. That Australia had the temerity, along with the United States, to call for an independent investigation into the source of the virus has angered China and resulted in accompanying repercussions. Pacific Island Forum leaders embrace Pacific regionalism as a means to mutual prosperity and sustainable development. However, Oceania, being the stage for political and economic competition and access to resources, is being impacted by the relationships between these powerful nations. In this context, the panelists will explore the topic US-China relations, implications for Oceania, interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. We have an excellent lineup of speakers and panelists today to address this very important topic. The first speaker that I'll introduce is Professor Dr. Thomas Saliver. Dr. Saliver is president of the Sunhak Universal Peace Graduate University outside of Seoul, Korea. He has his doctorate in comparative religion and Confucian thought from Harvard University, and he's taught for over 25 years at the universities and colleges in Canada, in the United States, as well as in China and Korea. His current research interests include the concepts of interdependence and mutual prosperity and universal values as moral and practical basis for human community. He serves as the international president of the Professors World Peace Academy and the international co-coordinator of the International Association of Academicians for Peace, IAAP. So I'd like to invite Professor Saliver to give his welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much, Greg, Secretary General Stone. It's a pleasure to be here and among you. I first want to offer congratulations to the organizers of this webinar. It's truly a wide scope from many parts of the world, addressing a critical issue of our time. I think that this webinar has several particular virtues that make it a fitting launch for IAAP in Oceania. As one of the pillars of UPF that's just coming into its own formation, to bring the academic resources to bear on peace building activities, along with the other communities that UPF serves. One of them is indeed the multidisciplinary character of this webinar, because insights from different academic fields need to be brought together in order to actually make progress in the very difficult peace building issues that we're talking about. Secondly, there's a wide representation of nationalities here. This is truly a multinational group. What undergirds that multinational community is a sense of shared concern for the well-being of each of us and our peoples. And that shared concern is what makes possible the ideals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and the realization of universal values that we're working toward. So I think this is a very fitting launch. I'm very excited about it. I'm quite interested myself in today's topic because I come from the United States and my field is China studies. So I also want to greet and express special pleasure to hear from all of our panelists. I'm looking forward to a great session this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Selova. Our next speaker is Mr. Yutaka Yamada. He is the chairman of UPF Oceania. He graduated from Sunburn University with a master's in theology, and he worked as a leader of youth and college students in Korea from 2004 to 2008. He was district director of the UPF in the Philippines, 2008 to 2013, after which he became the national director of UPF in Malaysia, 2013 to 19. And now he's moved to Oceania, as I said, as the chairman of UPF Oceania. So we will now welcome Mr. Yutaka Yamada for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Gregston. It is my great privilege to extend a very warm welcome to our panelists, speakers, and viewers from around the world for our UPF Peace Talks webinar featuring the inauguration of the International Association of Academicians for Peace, Oceania. The theme of the webinar is US-China relations, implication for Oceania, interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. Many people are not aware of how much the founders of UPF, Father Samuel Moon and Mother Hak Jo Han Moon, have invested over many years in promoting the role and importance of academics in contributing to world peace. Nearly 50 years ago, they established the International Conference of the Unity of the Sciences, known as ICOS. The beginnings were very modest. The first conference was held in New York in 1972, and it brought together 20 academics from 8 nations to discuss the moral orientation of the science. The second ICOS conference was held in Tokyo, Japan. It was attended by 60 academics from 12 nations. The third conference was held in London with 128 scholars, including 18 Nobel Prize winners. The chairman of that conference was the distinguished Nobel laureate Lord Adrien. In 1975, the fourth ICOS was again held in New York City. 300 participants from 50 nations met under the chairmanship of Nobel laureate Dr. Robert Mulligan. The fifth conference was held in Washington, D.C. with 360 scholars from 53 nations who discussed under the chairmanship of Nobel laureate Sir John Eccles the need for harmony amongst the sciences. San Francisco greeted the 6th annual conference held in 1976 with 400 participants from 57 nations. Subsequent conferences grew even bigger and were chaired by eminent scholars such as Nobel laureate Ingrid Wigner. The 10th ICOS conference in 1981 was the first to be held in Korea, the homeland of the founders. The chairman of the 10th ICOS was Professor Morton Kaplan, renowned political scientist and international relations scholar. He observed the following: the idea that science and value lie in two competing and different areas is one of the most disastrous idea that has characterized the 20th century. The ICOS attract people who are like-minded, not with respect to their views of foreign policy, development, or government organization, but who are like-minded in that we recognize the intimate relationship between so-called facts and so-called values, which are merely different aspects of human transaction with the world. It is evident in the world plagued by environmental pollution, poverty, and war that there is often a misdirection of our scientific knowledge. Underlying this fact is a fundamental crisis of values and a loss of confidence in traditional religious and philosophical belief as a standard of moral and ethics behavior. There is a growing awareness for the need to harmonize the diverse field of knowledge with a guiding standard of values. ICOS was able to bring together scientists, social scientists, and scholars from the humanities to explore many subjects and involve different disciplines and even opposing political and academic views, and to foster a new vision of the spiritual unity of humankind. At the 10th ICOS, in his founder's address, Reverend Moon advocated the harmonization of East and West, as well as North and South, and proposed the International Peace Highway beginning in Asia, connecting Japan through Korea and into China, eventually connecting the whole world. The purpose is to connect the whole world to overcome the North-South and East-West division of the world, centering on God's love, which is the absolute value. Other projects dealing with the academic community, such as the Professors World Peace Academy. I don't have time to explain here. Suffice is to say that the International Association of Academicians for Peace, founded just last year by Madam Moon, is a continuation of the same theme. The draw on the intellect, capacity, and wisdom of the academic community to contribute powerfully to the realization of world peace. We are very happy to be launching the Oceania branch of IAAP today with this webinar, and we invite academics to join together and to fully support this noble endeavor for peace. Thank you for once again for your attendance, and on behalf of UPF Oceania, we wish you a fruitful, productive, and enjoyable seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yutaka, giving us that backgrounder, especially about the involvement of the academic community in the work of UPF. We will now move on to our panel presentations. Each keynote panelist is a prominent and highly respected scholar in their own right, with extensive experience in the topic under discussion today. They will offer their insights and their reflections on the current state of US-China relations and its implications for the Oceania region. Our first panelist is Professor Christopher R. Hill. He's been a career diplomat. He was confirmed by the United States Senate for 5 senior positions, including US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, Ambassador to Iraq, South Korea, Macedonia, and Poland. He was also the US Special Envoy during the Kosovo War and a negotiator at the Dayton Peace Accords, which ended the Bosnian War. He is currently the Chief Advisor to the Chancellor for Global Engagement and Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy at the University of Denver. We now welcome Mr. Christopher Hill to deliver his presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk in this very, I think, very important session. You know, the United States and China, we have had our problems, and usually our problems are more intense during election times. I mean, whenever we have an election, every 4 years, I mean, there's a lot of concern about whether somehow China has somehow been able to take advantage of the United States, et cetera. So I would say that this election is no exception. This election year is no exception to that. But I would say, however, that this election year is a more serious problem than we've had in the past. Our president considers China one of the main problems or main impediments, really, to U.S. in the world. Our president has made very clear that China is a force to be reckoned with. That China is really a main competitor. And I would say the problem has arisen, and this relationship has deteriorated for a number of reasons. First of all, there is this perception that China has benefited from the United States' willingness to accept China into the international economic system, and that somehow China has not responded and not reciprocated as a member in good standing, as a responsible stakeholder. The second issue, of course, is that China has also had its own domestic problems, and these domestic problems have sometimes been regarded in the United States as problems that have somehow violated really various human rights law in the United Nations, but in particular, the issue of the way China has dealt with Hong Kong, how it's dealt with its Uyghur population in Shenzhen province. So there are a lot of concerns there. And then most recently, and perhaps most importantly and most severely, there is the perception in the United States that China has somehow not only mismanaged the COVID-19 crisis, but has somehow willingly or otherwise somehow exported this COVID-19 crisis. So there's a lot to be concerned about in terms of sort of general public attitudes to China. To be sure, over the years, China's economic success that I think most Americans have very much appreciated and very much understood as being the result of great efforts by the Chinese. But for many Americans, these economic successes seem to have come at the expense of American workers. Now, I would argue that if you look at job loss in the US, it's far more related to the issue of automation. That is, some 60% of job loss can be directly attributed to the issue of more computers, more automation in economic production. But I think China, unfortunately, has become the symbol of this job loss. To be sure, there are other countries that have been able to replace the US in markets, whether it's in textiles or various light industries. But for some reason, China has become the symbol of this. So we now have a situation where it is, the relationship is worse than it's ever been. Many Americans believe that China is somehow out to displace the US from world leadership. And I think in particular, our current administration under President Trump has decided he's had enough of this and is going to be very, very clear and very aggressive in trying to pull back this perception or pull back the idea that China has taken advantage of the US and is going to make sure that China understands that it has to somehow work with the US and not work against the US. My own view, and I think that's why I'm on this webinar to express that view, is that to a great extent, China and the United States have much more in common than they do differences. And we need to find patterns of cooperation. We need to work with China. I think there needs to be far more of a diplomatic discourse than there's been in the past year or so. It was kind of shocking, for example, to know that the American Secretary of State has not met the Chinese Foreign Secretary in China or has not visited China in over a year and a half. These are clearly problems of communication. But I think more fundamentally, the Chinese also need to understand that running enormous surpluses with the United States is not just the United States' problem, it's China's problem as well. That these surpluses that China has been able to run against the United States are ones that are, to borrow a phrase from the environmental movement, are really unsustainable. After all, when you see billions and billions of dollars outflowing to China and nothing in return, there is this perception that somehow China has taken advantage of the US. My own view is this argues for more dialogue, not less dialogue. This argues for an effort by the US to engage China and see if we can reach an understanding on some of these problems. Unfortunately, this is not the case right now, and we've seen invectives hurled from both sides at a level that we have never seen or not seen really, frankly, since the 1950s. So I think there needs to be a sort of calming down, and there needs to be really an effort to see how can we bring these two great countries together. What kind of patterns of cooperation can we find where we are able to work with China on difficult issues, but work with China to our common good? I've always felt that the Korean issue, the North Korea issue, is an area where the US and China have very similar views. We need to dissuade North Korea from the view that they should have nuclear weapons. And we need to work together on this project. But there is really a mountain of mistrust here. Many Americans, especially in our national security field, believe that China actually enjoys watching North Korea develop nuclear weapons because in their development that somehow preoccupies the United States. So we have really fundamental problems of miscommunication and an unwillingness really to sit down and see if we can work on these issues together. Now, with respect, of course, to the issue of the Pacific, the United States is a Pacific power. It has been a Pacific power for many years. If you look at when the United States first began to trade with China, you have to go back all the way to the 18th century. And certainly through the 19th century, the US has been very much engaged in the Pacific. And certainly in World War II, where the US fought alongside China against the Empire of Japan, alongside Australia, alongside New Zealand, there is a great tradition of working with our partners in the Pacific. So I look at the Pacific. If you look at a map, it's a rather big area. And to be sure, there ought to be ways that we can work with China, and yet we are not finding them. And I think part of this goes beyond the issue of the US and China. It goes to the issue of the US and its partners and its allies, whether in Australia or frankly in Europe. I think the US can make a much more significant impression on the Chinese if there were an impression that the US had support from its other partners and allies in the world. So I think these are times when I think it's very important for the US to work with countries like Australia to make China understand that this is not just a US problem or a US-China problem. This is a China problem with the rest of the world. A lot of the issues that have so bedeviled the US in terms of China's challenge, that is things like China's not respecting of intellectual property rights, these kinds of questions. These are problems that occur in Australia, and these are problems that also occur in China's own relations in Europe as well. So I think the US, it behooves the US in dealing with China and presenting a strong position to China to try to patch up its relations with its allies in Europe and elsewhere, and especially in its relations in the Pacific. Xi Jinping said himself just a few years ago that there is plenty of room in Asia Pacific for both the US and China. And yet, when you look at how this has developed over the years lately, you can see that the US and China have not been able to work this out. China has essentially taken the South China Sea and tried to turn it into a Chinese lake. This has to stop. There needs to be a better understanding between the US and China on how to deal with that question. So I don't know what will happen in the US politically. We will come to a very important election in November 3rd in the US. I can't predict how that will go. I can't predict really what the policies will be, but I can predict that I think anyone who wins that election will understand the absolute importance of China and the US trying to work through these problems. China needs to understand that the United States or any other country cannot be oblivious to the UN Charter, cannot be oblivious to the various human rights rules of the road. That are not just the US's rules, they are the world's rules. And I think China needs to understand that in presenting itself as a model, and to a great extent, China is a model of development. After all, they have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But China needs to understand there are certain rules of the road in terms of its treatment of its own people that are not just the US rules. These are rules throughout the world. So I hope there can be a kind of calming down of the current tension and a willingness to talk to each other, and most importantly, to listen to each other. Because right now this is getting in the wrong direction, and I think we need to do a lot to fix this. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the views of these very distinguished panelists.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, Professor Hill, and highlighting the different underlying perceptions that are getting in the way of good dialogue, and also you're encouraging finding common ground, more dialogue, honest dialogue, in order to resolve these issues. So thank you so much. Our next panelist is Professor Baiman Prasad, former Professor of Economics and Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of the South Pacific, based in Fiji. Currently Adjunct Professor at James Cook University in Australia and Punjabi University in India. He is currently a Member of Parliament and the leader of the National Federation Party in Fiji. So it's our great pleasure to invite Professor Baiman Prasad to speak to us today.
Thank you, Gregory, and it's a pleasure to join such a distinguished set of panelists. Very happy to hear Professor Hill and the background that he's provided with respect to China-US relations, and indeed China-US tensions, as one might want to put it. For the Pacific, especially for the Northern and the Southwest Pacific, historically, these countries have been aligned with the Western powers. The Northern Pacific mainly with the United States, the Southwestern Pacific, including the US, plus other Western countries, Australia, New Zealand in particular, but also UK, France, Japan, and more recently the European Union as a whole. I think many of the Pacific countries, Southwest Pacific and the Northern Pacific countries, have had a long history of democratic governance and democratic traditions coming out of the colonial rule in many of them, having adopted those governance systems. So I think that has always been considered as being the influence of Western powers in the Pacific. And in fact, many of the Western powers have seen the Pacific as their backyard and their sphere of influence. But since President Xi took office in 2013, although even before 2013, most of the Pacific Island countries have had very close relationship and diplomatic ties with China. But since 2013 in particular, from my understanding, Beijing has bolstered its involvement in the Pacific through economic, cultural, and diplomatic ties. And Australia and New Zealand, of course, for a long time, were undisputed power in Oceania. In fact, one might recall in 2003, the then US President George Bush controversially described Australia as a sheriff in the Asia Pacific. But we know recently China has been challenging that hegemony using soft power, hard power, aid, grants. Some people call it checkbook diplomacy, and various other means. And more recently, I think China's military maneuvers, and some people call it aggression in the Indo-Pacific, is kind of having a ripple effect on Oceania as a whole. And in some ways, the Western powers are kind of suspicious and wary about Chinese intentions in the region. And recent outcries, for example, over media reports that China was about to build a naval base in Vanuatu, which of course been denied by both China and Vanuatu. And the feeling is that China is trying to replace the United States in the Southwest Pacific, and indeed, Australia and New Zealand. And there's been a increase or noticeable increase engagement by the Western powers in the Pacific as a result of that view. And I think that has created a somewhat uneasiness about China's intentions in the Pacific, not only amongst politicians, but among scholars and the ordinary people. For example, at the grassroots level, there's already tension in the Solomon Islands when it switched from its diplomatic ties with Taiwan to China, and also in Vanuatu about increased Chinese presence. And this is all with respect to
Professor Prasad, we can't hear you. Did you put that on mute? Just check that you take that off mute.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you
That's
hear
fine.
me?
Hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I was saying is, because of this increased presence of China in the Pacific, there is this unease at various levels. At the political level, at the grassroots level, and also amongst the Western powers. And as a result of that, there seems to be an increased engagement of the Western powers with the Pacific countries. And many observers see that as a result of the increased Chinese presence in the Pacific. I think what is very important for us to understand, and China also to understand, is that historically Pacific countries had a tradition of adopting democratic institutions, media freedom, human rights. These have been some of the colonial legacies, in terms of the institutions of governance and institutions of managing these countries. And so many of the countries in the Pacific, and especially in the Southwest Pacific, the existence of the Pacific Forum, which is a group of all political leaders, has always talked about, close cooperation within the Pacific island countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand, which are very important members of the Pacific Islands Forum. And there's been a big push to bring about closer, deeper, and more meaningful regional integration within the Pacific Island countries. And I think part of the reason why there might be this tension about the presence of China, although on one hand many of the Pacific countries find it very easy and perhaps economically fruitful to have very close ties with China, because China does provide a lot of aid. Chinese loans have been talked about as an important element of how the Chinese presence in the Pacific has been increased over a period of time. And in fact, there is this view about liberal democracy and the authoritarian nature of what might be experienced by the Pacific Island countries if if China, for example, has a much deeper and meaningful and aggressive influence in the Pacific. The other point that people talk about in the Pacific, of course, is the climate change commitment of the our Western powers, our traditional allies, as opposed to what China might do. The third issue is Chinese debt, and some people are talking about Chinese debt trap. I think studies have shown that at the moment that is not the case. The Pacific Island countries are not in some kind of a debt trap, but many observers and statistics also show that there could be a risk of that happening. For example, Tonga already has more than 50% of the debt, which comes from China. So I think in going forward, the Chinese have to understand that. See, the other factor in the Pacific is, like many other countries around the world, which have one China policy, but they have very close relationship, economic ties, trade ties with Taiwan as well. And many of these countries, which have democratic traditions in their own country, feel quite important to have that relationship with Taiwan. Recently, for example, Kiribati and Solomon Islands, changed the diplomatic ties from Taiwan to China. And increasingly, I think the countries which have one China policy, but also had close ties with Taiwan, feel that China has become very, very sensitive about these countries having that relationship with Taiwan. And I think that itself could be the basis of some of the tensions that we see between US and China, because whether we like it or not, whether China likes it or not, many of these countries, including Australia, New Zealand, US, India, countries in the European Union, have very, very close ties with Taiwan, and much of it is economic ties. And I think, as Professor Hill said, that if US and China, he said that there will be mutually, the relationship can be mutually beneficial if they work together. But I think China also has to understand that in the Pacific, at the grassroots, people like democracy. People want the governments to be accountable, transparent. They want the governments to respect media freedom, human rights. And these are fundamental issues for many Pacific countries and their people. And while China may have been successful right now in building its influence through some of the activities such as loan, grants, and other influences, at the end of the day, I think the people at the grassroots level would want to maintain very clearly those democratic traditions and institutions and the freedom, to engage with governments and the political process in a transparent, accountable, and in a manner that human rights are not violated in any particular way. So I think much of the tension that the fallout that could come from China-US tensions globally could also be very noticeable in the Pacific, and the issue of how this is going to play out in the final analysis will depend on how the people in the Pacific, at the grassroots level, and people like us, who are lawmakers, who are politicians, we have been born into this tradition of transparency, accountability, human rights, and democracy. Although we've had two or three coups in Fiji, I think that the tradition of democracy is still very, very strong. So in the long run, I think that recognition by China and its sensitivity towards countries in the Pacific which might be engaging with countries like Taiwan, because they feel that other countries, their close allies, the Western powers, are close allies of Taiwan as well, although many of them maintain one China policy. So in the long run, I think that recognition by China, as well as the US, that China does have this positive influence in terms of the support it provides to the Pacific Island countries, is recognized. I think a mutually beneficial relationship can develop, without that kind of competition that many people already see happening in other parts of the world with China and the US, and also happening in the Pacific now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, and also for explaining the increased presence and interest of China in the Pacific region, especially since 2013, and how that influence is impacting the region, how it's felt at the grassroots level, how it's perceived in particularly the Pacific Island nations as well. So thank you for that wonderful presentation. Our next presenter is Professor Anup Swarup. He's the founding Vice Chancellor of the Jagaran Lake City University. He's the Chairman of the Center for Global Non-Killing and Chairman of the Global Knowledge Alliance. He's the recipient of the Hiroshima Peace Award in Japan, the Presidential Award for the Republic of India, and also several honorary doctorates and fellowships and awards. Professor Swarup has over 40 years of distinguished professional experience in diverse roles, such as educationist, poet, peace activist, life scientist, futurist, social entrepreneur, and civil servant. So the United Nations Security Council representative, he was the representative appointed by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and also he has been the Commissioner for Customs at the Government of India. So let us now give a warm welcome for Professor Anup Swarup.
Thank you, Greg. I should at the outset compliment the Universal Peace Federation as well as the International Association of Academicians for Peace. This is a topic in these challenging times which is critically important for all of us, not in the oceanic region, but the entire world. So let me come straight to what I see from the UNESCO Charter, and it states that since aggression and threats of peace are in the minds of men, we should also build the bridges when it comes to peace, and these bridges are possible only through efforts and initiatives such as this one. So let me compliment you and also Chairman Yutaka, the very distinguished panelists here today. We heard both Professor Christopher Hill as well as Professor Biman Prasad, and the exposition was so good that I was just wondering what I have to speak next. So let me come straight to the point, and I address the viewers from across the globe. I think we are online on Facebook. So let me come straight to the point. And I was thinking not only in terms of South China Sea, but of course, more importantly, the South Pacific and the Quad, which consists of course, United States, Australia, Japan, and India. And I was wondering what is happening is actually intimidation of China. Now, when you're thinking of peace, I was thinking that I will come straight to the point, and peace implies creative approaches. These creative approaches can be through various means. And I was thinking of various pillars which can be there to build peace. And these pillars can be mutual respect for each other. Then there is very important, that is mutual non-interference, and then mutual coexistence. Also, sustainable development, as mentioned in the UPF theme, sustainable development, mutual prosperity, and also shared prosperity is so important in the region. That is possible only if the Pacific Islands get together. Now, the point is, what I was wondering, that post-COVID, of course, there are issues, and Christopher, very, I would say, he had explained the whole, the entire, in its gamut, the entirety of the issues, as of course, Professor Biman Prasad. So I'll not go into those details. I'll come to a very short point. And that short point is that there has to be a balancing act when it comes to the Pacific Islands. And that balancing act is important not only for their shared prosperity, but for mutual goodwill in the region. And if they get together, they will bring the Quad together, which means Australia, Japan, of course, United States and India. And that is possible if we focus on issues such as global warming. Global warming, and the Board declaration was an extraordinarily good move on the part of Pacific Islands. I feel that the Pacific Islands Forum should be expanded to have all the four, so that the Pacific, of course, there is a strategic geopolitical importance of the Pacific. It's a place, not only the biggest ocean, but also rich in resources, and also it can contain all the landmass of Earth in itself. So then that itself makes it very, very geostrategically important. Now, China would be interested not only in the mining resources, deep sea mining, I mean, and also in the sea lanes, because it needs, after all, energy security, because the Gulf lanes and by lanes are very tedious. So they might be looking for another route through the Pacific and through Australasia. So that is one point. Second, of course, fishing. So China has its own interest, and national interest at times, it overtakes international process, international interest. So what is to be done is that the Pacific Islands, they can get together and form a approach which is creative, not only creative, but also which is fulfilling to all the parties in the region. That is quite possible in case we focus on energy security, global warming, development, good governance. These are the focal issues when I think of the Pacific Islands and Oceania as such. So these issues, if we focus on, make a forum which is all inclusive, not exclusive at all, where all the countries get together. This is how I think we can confront the emerging geopolitical problems, the challenge which we are going to face. Heading the Center for Global Non-Killing, I should mention that we have already expounded the view that peace is possible, and the peace has to be positive peace. And when I talk of positive peace, it has to be affirmative, it has to be positive, and it has to be non-killing peace. Now, when you talk in those terms, there's a reverence to life as such. There is much, much more, because we have to build the institutions that focus on peace. We have to not only build the institutions, but also empower these institutions. So that is very much possible to my mind if the Pacific Islanders get together. We all, of course, what is most important in our world today is freedom, democracy, and liberal norms. Those are the values which we can not only cultivate amongst the islands themselves, but also like a light, like a beacon, we can promote all over the globe. Why not? So when I'm talking about this, let me also say, and this is very important, now what is happening in the islands is one-upmanship. When you talk of one-upmanship, then there is no end. China, of course, has promoted the Asia Investment Bank. Now the thing is that AIB should not be seen as a confrontation to the World Bank or to the Asian Development Bank. as most of the countries in the region are eyeing this. Also, Professor Biman rightly mentioned, he was talking that there is a debt trap. It might be happening in some countries. But then what is so important is we need that money. So maybe there are positive ways, affirmative ways where we can have a dialogue with the Chinese and we can come to a conclusion where the soft loans are provided on easy terms, not only from the Asia Investment Corporation or Asia Investment Bank, but also from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and the entire world can get together, because there is a geostrategic importance of the Pacific oceanic islands, and it is important not only for global warming to counter environmental challenge, but also for shared prosperity in our entire world. So I'll just come to a very quick point. Instead of having mutually assured destruction, MAD as you call it, what we need is a mutually assured prosperity and peace, or MAP. And also we need, instead of lethality, we need all the investment which goes into the armies across the globe, into security concerns, to come for prosperity, for economic peace, for trade and development. I know that we had this TPP, or I call it Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was promoted earlier during the Obama regime, but unfortunately during Trump times, it was done away with. But that led a big gap. Now that gap has to be countered, and RCEP was something which was promoted by the Chinese, but many of the countries in the region, they withdrew. Now, the problem is that RCEP was meant for regionalization. As you said, we need mutual interdependence. We need a regional effort when it comes to trade and economics. And that is what the Pacific Island nations need. But instead of that, we went on a wrong course. So my only point is, and I will make it very clear right away, that instead of one-upmanship, instead of might is right, what we need is right should become the might, the other way around. And that is very much possible. And in the end, I would just quote from Mahatma Gandhi. He said, if we don't fight the darkness with light, then the whole world will become dark. So what we need here is a light, and I should compliment the Universal Peace Federation as well as the Academicians for Peace in the Oceania for having taken this great opportunity and to bring together experts and all the wisdom from across the globe to make the world a positive world for all of us. With these words, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Swarup, especially your focus.
Greg, you're muted somehow. Could you unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay, my apologies. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, Professor Swarup, for another great presentation, and for pointing out also the that light overcomes the darkness. So we need to counter this kind of one-upmanship, a more aggressive approach with the positive approaches for development, and focus on, you know, Pacific Island nations working together and bringing development and peace together. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Mr. Osman Softik. He is a senior research fellow with the Islamic Renaissance Front, an intellectual think tank based in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. He's also a coordinator for the recently established Foreign Relations Council in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He graduated from the Faculty of Islamic Studies in Sarajevo, and he holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. His career spans business sector, academia, and journalism. His research focuses on international relations, Middle East politics and Islam in Southeast Asia. He contributed articles to publications such as Al Jazeera Balkans, Online Opinion, Engage, Open Democracy, The Frontier Post, and many others. The Universal Peace Federation, named him Ambassador for Peace, and is currently based in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and is a dual Australian and Bosnian citizen. It's our great pleasure to invite comments now from Mr. Osman Softic.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Mr. Yamada, for affording me this opportunity to participate in this immensely important webinar and allowing me to give my own personal perspective in relation to developments between the United States and China and how it impacts the Oceania region, where I myself spent 20 years at least, and where my children were born and still live in Sydney, Australia. So some might ask question, how come this person from Bosnia and Herzegovina, who is so far away, has interest in the Pacific and Oceania region? So I thought I would provide a little bit of background, personal background, so we can understand. I have been following the situation, particularly in Australia, because being Australian citizen, I am very much aware what's going on and what's happening in Australia in relation to China and in the region. And being Bosnian and Australian Muslim, I am somebody who studied Islamic studies and Islamic world more closely. I am very much concerned about the human rights violations against a large group of Muslim population, particularly in, for instance, in China's Western Xinjiang province. So this is very important personal question, personal issue, not only for me, but for many Muslims who are concerned for peace and well-being of humanity at large. As a keen student of international relations, I have been following the development between the United States and China, and we can see that many scholars of international relations are very concerned about this competition and about the impact of China's economic, military, and political rise in Asia, in East Asia in particular. And obviously throughout history, we've seen that China dominated this region, and the last period of 100 or so years, what Chinese regard as national humiliation, they see this as some kind of interregnum and something that is short and that will pass, and that the Chinese civilization, what Samuel Huntington termed it, will again dominate its region. So from the international relations perspective, I am concerned that perhaps a lot of people that are observing China and the relations between these great powers, China and the United States, often don't recognize or don't see, because the Chinese authorities or Beijing politics from Beijing is often trying to disguise its moves and veiling them in diplomatic language. One of them, for instance, BRI initiative or One Belt, One Road initiative, or Maritime Silk Routes, new Silk Road, which China initiated in 2013 or 2014. These are all great things, and China is presenting these initiatives to the rest of the world, particularly to the third world countries, as win-win situation. However, we can see that this raised a lot of concern, not only with the policymakers in the United States, but also in Western Europe in recent times, and also in Australia. So I think we need to take, and this is my personal view, and I share this view with many other people, that China needs to be looked at from a more realist perspective, not just idealizing China like some scholars have been trying to do. And there is no doubt, as Mr. Ambassador has quite clearly pointed out, as a practitioner and a diplomat of experience and a scholar in his own right, that China has lifted hundreds of millions of people from poverty. I think about 600 million people, as opposed to India, about 260 million people out of poverty. And this is a significant contribution. However, I think we also need to understand that the Asia, as we look at it, is not only about China. One of the most prominent Australian international relations scholars and my former professor, Michael Wesley, currently at Melbourne University, has written a fascinating book titled Rising Asia. And in his book, he mentions that Asia is much more than China. Therefore, I believe that the United States, Australia, and its Western allies need to maintain a closer relationship with other Asian countries, such as Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, and of course, India. Very important country and a great power in its own right, in order to show to China and demonstrate to China that potential Chinese domination of its own region and the rest of the world will not be allowed and will not pass unchallenged. These are very sensitive issues, but I think scholars often neglect them, some scholars, but they need to be pointed out because it is very important. In relation to the Pacific, Oceania and the Pacific region, Pacific Islands, it is very important in my view to mention and to point out that the Pacific Island communities and countries are very diverse, and they are very plural. And I believe that China is encroaching the Pacific Island nations and targeting those countries that historically have grudges against the West. For instance, we know that the Pacific Island countries are divided, and the Pacific as a region is divided into Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia, particularly the region where our respected professor comes from, Professor Biman in Fiji, belongs to Melanesia. And if we look at the history, we will realize that this region has often been unstable, and there is a term, I'm not sure who coined it exactly, but it's called Melanesian socialism. So it is my contention that China is particularly targeting Melanesian countries because of their susceptibility to some ideological similarity to what a Chinese might see as a sympathetic to China. This is something that I think it's important to point out. Another thing also is very disturbing, for instance, that in recent months and let's say in a few years, there has been a significant interference of China into Australia. And this has been publicized a lot, and everybody can read about it, but it is very serious. And Australia, as a small country of only 25 million people, but its land mass is huge. And as a Western ally and the close ally of the United States, has showed and demonstrated quite significant resilience in relation to what the Chinese policies or the Beijing authorities have been trying to achieve. And we are very concerned, and particularly people in Europe as well began to realize that China has actually abandoned its soft diplomacy and soft diplomatic approach, and now is using the so-called the wolf warrior diplomacy, which is, there is a fascinating article published only a few days ago in the Foreign Affairs Journal, which is quite disturbing, that China has realized its own power and using vacuum that has been created by the COVID-19 pandemics. And I think this is a quite serious concern. This is not a secret. A renowned professor from Australia, Professor Clive Hamilton, has written a book called Silent Invasion. And I will share my experience. A few years ago, I was in Tasmania, and I bought this book at the airport, and I was reading it, and I met one of Australian business people, and he said to me, it's a fascinating book. You'll love it, you'll read it, it's all true, but don't take it with you in China. Don't take you to China. So this just demonstrates how people perceive what China is doing and what is presenting to the world diplomatically does not necessarily have to be truth. And if we look at the work of theorists such as Professor John Mearsheimer, for instance, who has been arguing for a long time that if the China continues to rise, it will eventually and it will eventually want to dominate its region and to expel the United States from the second island chains, at least for the beginning, and then dominate the entire region. And of course, this is a great concern for Australia and for Pacific Island countries. And this is why also we have to be aware that the China is also influencing the international institutions such as World Health Organizations. And our respected Professor Biman will probably agree that the alternative, you mentioned the Pacific Island Forum in Fiji, which is a paramount regional multilateral organization. But when Fiji was expelled from the Pacific Island Forum and was not member of it for quite a number of years, and then created Pacific Island Development Forum, which is the alternative to Pacific Island Forum, we have seen that the significant interest of China in this development, and China financially invested quite a lot in this alternative, which also indicates the willingness of China to disturb the established regional order in the, at least in the Southwestern Pacific, in Melanesian region. So there are a lot of issues that we should be concerned about. Obviously, there is no alternative to diplomacy and to building bridges and reconciliation and trying to find the best way of coexistence. Obviously, China is a significant and formidable power to be reckoned with, and it is not only a matter of ideology or political system, it is also a matter of power. But from my own perspective and my own background and religious affiliation, I think that there is a lot of room, that there is a lot of space for discussion and trying to find a proper solution and discussion between different nations, particularly between Australia and Indonesia. I think in the past, and I mentioned that in a number of times in previous discussions, there was too much emphasis, I think, on and fear of Islam, and obviously there was a legitimate concern for terrorism, but we realized that there are much larger, much bigger dangers facing the world, and I think this situation with rising China may provide opportunity for countries such as Australia and Indonesia to get closer together, and also India. It is interesting that some of the quite famous scholars like Kishore Mahbubani from Singapore believes that this is the time for China and India to actually rise up, and this is the new world order where civilization is changing, the world is changing, and the Asian or Eastern powers will dominate. I disagree with this view. I believe that civilizations, different civilizations and different countries have to find common ground, and as our topic today indicates, universal values. And we all share, as a previous speakers mentioned, we share the universal values of peace and the dignity and democracy and freedom. And I think these are the values that are shared between Australia and the United States and also Pacific Island nations. And I think there is a lot of room to discuss how this can be improved, because there is a lot of resentment as well in the Pacific Island communities against some Western countries because of historical perspective, because they feel that the Australia and the United States perhaps haven't done enough to help them decolonize. We have the presence of France in the Pacific, which is the only European power which has a strong presence in the Pacific. So we have a pluralism there. But certainly we should never abandon, I believe, our values. Our religious values are very important, and these are often neglected at the expense of our inner feelings and our traditions and religious values. Economics is important and development is important, and certainly China is contributing a lot in terms of economics. But economics alone and development alone and infrastructure alone is not enough to sustain our societies, our civilization. I think we have to think of deeper meanings and more significant values to complement this economic development with religious and the social values and universal values that we all share. Unfortunately, as we look at it now and what's happening in the region in South China Sea in relation to what's happening to the Muslims, Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province in China, which are being interned, and some even are saying there is a kind of silent ethnic cleansing. What's happening in other parts of the world, I think there is a place for concern. This may be quite alarmist view, some might think, but I believe that this should also be taken into consideration, and we should not be just led by this, should be mesmerized by what is promised by BRI initiatives or Belt and Road initiatives. Certainly these are very important for humanity, but we should also look at different values, and if we can somehow, our scholars and our policymakers and politicians have to find ways, and religious leaders, definitely, faith communities, how to find a common ground to emphasize these values as opposed to economics alone. this is my own perspective, my own view of the situation, and also we can see that China is becoming very aggressive in even at the mentioning of the name which does not fit within its own view of the universe. For instance, in recent years, or say in recent
Osman,
months,
sorry, we're just running out of time a bit there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll stop there then.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for another very, very interesting perspective from Osman Softic, highlighting many issues, looking at the real big picture, trying to evaluate, not to idealize China, you know, sort of explaining about his concerns in various areas, including human rights, and asking us also to factor in other Asian nations besides just China. And, you know, it's a very important concern and very important points he made. Our final speaker is Dr. John Dr. John Bellevance. He has a PhD from Monash University on the role of values in the use of information technologies. He is a Cisco certified network instructor. He has been teaching information technology for over 20 years. He's worked also in the non-profit sector for some 40 years. And he received acknowledgement from President Reagan for his work to fight crack cocaine use in the African-American community in Canada. So in Australia, he is the National Vice President of the Universal Peace Federation and one of the founders of Africa Day Australia, and he was Vice President of that organization for 5 years. So his driving value is love, and he wants to express that in living for the sake of others. So we'll now welcome Dr. John Dr. John Bellevance for his presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Look, I've got the honor to do this in about 5 to 6 minutes. I'm going to wrap up. I want to just give you a bit of a journey from 1972, the founders of UPF and academic work. So they've given us, I'd like to give you sort of a 20-year or many-year journey of what their ideas were with respect to the role of academics in fostering universal values, interdependence, and mutual prosperity. So since '72, the founders have advocated these values in academic conferences. And we are clearly facing global challenges that need a global response, hence the role of academics. The first major challenge that we need to be addressed is a lack of values perspective. And a lot of the people today, a lot of the presenters today spoke about this, but I'd like to talk about it with respect to guiding scientific, technological, political, and economic development. And so I will say that in 1980s, early 1980s, the founder was very prophetic and said, look, the peace of the globe will depend on US, China, Japan, Korean relations. So whatever your views on that are, it doesn't matter. This becomes a very significant idea because we really are living in the Pacific era. So most academic and technological development has been motivated by the idea to improve the human condition. However, we can clearly see that in the world plagued with unsustainable exploitation of natural resources, famine, conflict, and inequality, it's evident that science and technology have not yet been used as ethically and as effectively as they could be, hence the role of academics. The ethical desire to use development for prosperity and peace of humanity in some way is being sidelined or even undermined by the role of values, by the lack of values perspective. And this has several dimensions. The first is that adhering to scientific neutrality excluded from values consideration has actually caused many problems in the 20th and 21st centuries. So when academics fail to emphasize values, this diminishes the importance of values perspective in the minds of human beings and by extension in its applications. The second is the problem associated with lack of values perspective is the growth of selfish individualism, or what the founder referred to as the materialistic values perspective. In industrialized nations, clearly today, self-fulfillment, materialism, free enterprise, economic growth have become major components of our worldview. These are good, but they need to be deployed for the common good. So for example, environmental problems are primarily a problem of selfish human behavior. The third problem is the lack of a global identity and consciousness, which is what many of you spoke about today. When it comes to climate change, to health, to economics, to conflict, countries are not sovereign. We truly live in a global village. And these require global solutions based on a global worldview. So at IAAP and UPF, we seek to promote a global mindset, which we are, so that means that we are not against any nation, or quite the opposite. For instance, the founders have been great friends of China and the United States in the hope to support them in their journey as global citizens to help other nations. So if you want to know about that, email me or contact me. But the founder really has stepped in when there were very serious problems with Tiananmen Square in China. The founder started investing funds there. Why? He clearly said because he wanted to help China and help its development. The fourth problem with respect of lack of values perspective is that we have not exalted human dignity and care for our environment. So therefore, in order to advance human dignity and spiritual and moral values, these need to be combined with an academic analytical approach to foster equitable and sustainable development. So it's not possible to have scientific development or technological development without being centered on values. In my own area, which I teach software development and computing and development, there's a very famous quote that some of the great developers in technology have said that it is incumbent on human beings that we imbue goodness in how we develop technology. So solutions to human problems will come only, Dr. Moon said, through such a holistic approach. So scholars need to be pioneers, which sort of goes against a little bit the common trend, in the realm of conscience. And that is to inspire humankind to follow an ethical path so that humanity can cope with problems facing our world. The second major challenge, which some were brought up here today, is that transdisciplinary research activities and capacity need substantial and urgent expansion. This is a whole presentation itself, and I'm sure that many scientists have spoken about this from different perspectives. But back in the early days, the founder talked about this. So for example, although the vast majority of scientists concur that climate change is a fact, there is still no consensus regarding the best economic reaction to this threat. The world's problems require an interdisciplinary approach by scholars. The complicated problems of the world cannot be fully understood simply with the narrow perspective of an individual field of knowledge. Their solution is beyond the capability of any specialized society of scholars, and research conducted in various fields ultimately needs to be brought together through complementary relationship and cooperation to serve the common good. This leaves me with the concept of interdependence. Interdependence means that my actions affects others and the actions of others affect me. Selfish individualism, the founder said, thinks that the self can exist outside the relationship with others. But in our global village, nation states cannot deal with global problems on their own, and hence a global identity and a global approach is unavoidable. And some in the economic field say that in fact it is seriously dangerous. We are facing today seriously dangerous problems because economic conflict can lead actually to other forms of conflict. So what we're talking about today is an extremely urgent issue in our global village. So we know it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to build a tool, to solve a problem, to solve a conflict, and even to cure a disease. Our shared struggle with respect to health, economic, sustainable development, and peace show us how interdependent we truly are. As our world shrinks to a global village, the world's people are challenged to overcome national, racial, and religious barriers and learn to live together in harmony. A spirit of cooperation can only be attained when human beings come to view themselves as members of the same human family. And finally, this brings me to the issue of mutual prosperity. Dr. Moon said, if developed nations cannot have a noble thought greater than the pursuit of profit, they will end up declining no matter how hard they try to prosper. How can we be at peace when our neighbor is dying because of hunger, disease, and ignorance? In a world, the world is gone from a system built around walls. Right at the end of the Cold War, we felt that the world had changed, that the walls had come down, but we have now live in a world built around networks. The globalized world has truly arrived, but it is also a source of vulnerability and competition, which we talked about today. We need to reconsider, was shared today, this view, the international political economic systems and their entrenched divisions. Advancement in science and technology can equalize the means of productions to create mutual prosperity. This is another final point that the founder talked about. He talked about creating mutual prosperity, equalization of technology. He said technology belongs to all of humanity. In order to have a harmonious society, all members of the global community should share the same standard of living. How can there be peace when people suffer? In fact, the former president of the World Bank argued that global economic development in poor nations can be very good for the bottom line. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. John Golovans, for a wonderful presentation there, penetrating further into the sub-themes of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universally shared values. Very interesting. Thank you. Our next section is the Q&A question and answer. I'd like to invite Mr. John Adamides, President of UPF Australia, to select just one or two questions. We only have time for one or two that have come in from the viewers, and to conduct the Q&A session. Over to you, John.
Okay, thank you everyone, and I really wish to congratulate you all for coming and speaking and really helping us understand this issue. I know the time is short and we're just running out, and if Greg would bear with me, allow me to ask three questions, and they're directed to three different people. Well, one is directed to Honourable Christopher Hill, and it's an interesting question. It's talking about the imbalance in debt and land ownership. Is China buying the US and the Pacific? And if so, how is America dealing with this? Is America buying into China, or is it only a one-sided event that's happening, that China is eating or buying up the Pacific and buying up the US? That's a question for Christopher Hill, if you'd like to address that, please.
Sure. I think this issue has come up many times in the United States. There's especially a concern that the Chinese have a relatively more open market in the US than US firms have in China. I don't think one should just look at this, however, from the perspective of, are they buying us out and therefore we're not buying them out? I think it really goes to far more fundamental issues of whether their markets are open vis-a-vis our markets, which are relatively open. I will say that the U.S. has pushed back greatly on some of the issues of invoking national security and preventing the Chinese from making certain purchases. My own feeling is we need to kind of liberalize on both sides, but it does need to be a two-way street. And I think China has had trouble understanding this. Now, there's much to be concerned about with China. It is, after all, a country with tremendous capability and tremendous investment in its military. So you can't really talk about it in the same terms that we did in the 1980s when we talked about Japan and their purchase of Rockefeller Center in New York, which raised a lot of hackles among Americans. It's a more serious issue with China because of their sense of competition with the U.S. that goes beyond just economic, but rather strategic. So I can assure you it's something the U.S. is very concerned about. And if I were the Chinese, I would do some thinking about this. And going back to an earlier comment I made, there needs to be an understanding that this kind of approach is not sustainable. At a certain point, they are going to engender a lot of concerns from the U.S. population that somehow there's something wrong here. And so I think the Chinese need to diversify their markets, and they need to act with, I think, much more restraint and much more understanding of how average Americans might look at some of this.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have, because of time, I just want to move ahead, is for Mr. Softic, and this is in relation to an overall, all of the things that he spoke, and the question is like this. It seems that the two powers are speaking different languages when they refer to peace. Yeah, how does he see that trust can be built between these two powers, primarily, China and the US? Okay.
Yes, that's a very good question. The United, if we look at the history, we can see that United States for a century has been preeminent global power, or some like to call it hegemonic power, which dominated the entire world, but mainly the regions, the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Persian Gulf region, which are the three major, most critical points any power would like to have influence or control over in order to dominate the world. And I think if we look at the history, and I think the scholars like even Samuel Huntington and John Mearsheimer, and particularly on people on the realist side of international relations politics, they believe that if China continues to rise, it will eventually confront the United States, because the United States will not be willing to give up its preeminent position in East Asia in particular. And what is the most concerning is the comparison of China with the Germany Second World War, after First World War. And we know that the American power, after displacing the British Empire, defeated Imperial Japan, defeated the Imperial Germany and the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. It came out as a winner of the Cold War conflict. And there is a reason to believe that the Americans will behave in the same way. So it is, as Ambassador Christopher Hill mentioned, the American people will realize that, and they will follow their leadership, and they will eventually support the United States in its way to preserve the peace in the world and to preserve the freedom of navigation and rules-based order. And I think the Chinese, what I mentioned earlier, wolf warrior diplomacy, will eventually fail. This is in my view, quite reasonable to expect.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your insights on that. And the last question I'd like to direct is to Professor Swarup. And this is in relation to development and service. There seems to be two perspectives that China and the US have, and in relation to their value systems. You know, there is development and service in the South Pacific really benefiting the South Pacific community, you know, or is the development and service only benefiting the US or China interests?
Very well said.
Okay.
Actually, to my mind, from South China Sea to the South Pacific, what is very interesting is that all the countries in the region, in the Pacific Rim, they do share mutually assured prosperity, which is possible only if there is mutually assured cooperation between China and the United States. And when I talk of China and the United States, I also mean countries in the region such as Taiwan, Korea, of course, Australia and Japan. They have to cooperate. When it comes to shared prosperity, it also means that they need the wherewithal when it comes to good governance. And good governance, economic prosperity, employment generation, all this is possible only when there is mutual cooperation in the region. And I should tell that this is mutually inclusive. It also implies that if you exclude anybody, any of the major powers, the whole purpose would be defeated. So I feel that it is mutually inclusive, whether it is China or the United States, when it comes to the countries in Oceania.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your input, and thank you everyone for your participation. I'll hand it back to you, Greg. Okay.
Thank you very much, John. And thank you very much for those questions and for those answers. We're just coming to a close now. Just before we say one or two closing remarks, we'd like to present two Ambassador for Peace certificates. The Ambassador for Peace certificate awards were initiated by the founders of UPF in 2001. The Ambassador for Peace network has now grown to being the largest and most diverse network of peace builders and peace leaders throughout the world. These ambassadors for peace come from all walks of life. They represent many races and many religions, nationalities and cultures, but they do have a commitment to certain common ground, and that is that they stand on the common ground of universal moral principles, promoting reconciliation, overcoming barriers and building peace. And this global network represents the diversity of the human family and all the different disciplines therein. They promote cooperation beyond the barriers of race, religion, and ethnicity and nationality. And they also practice the principle of living for the sake of others as a guiding principle to build global community. It's our very great pleasure to welcome two very distinguished people to receive this award, this Ambassador for Peace Certificate Award. The first is Ambassador for Peace Award for Professor Dr. Anup Swarup. He spoke earlier. We introduced him earlier as well, so I won't go over the bio again for Professor Swarup, but let us welcome him as a new Ambassador for Peace. We congratulate you, Professor Swarup.
Thank you.
Our second awardee for Ambassador for Peace Award is Roland Jabbour. Roland, his vision for leadership has achieved a wide-ranging successful partnerships between Australia and the Arab community, facilitating business and trade relations that work to promote stronger ties between Australia and the Arab world. He has developed a high profile as a community leader through long-standing commitment to public service and community initiatives. He's a firm believer in actively contributing to the society, and he has held numerous community positions and government appointments. He is the founding and current chairman of the Australian Arabic Council, the founding director of the Australian Lebanon Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the current president of the national chairman of the Australia Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the honorary consul general of the Kingdom of Morocco in the state of Victoria. Roland has been a recipient of many awards from Australia and from overseas governments in recognition of his service to the Australian community. And these include the Order of Australia Medal and the Medal for the Centenary of Federation of Australia, awarded by the Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia for service to the Australian community. So let us once again congratulate Mr. Roland Jabbour for receiving this award. Thank you so much. Now, to close out the seminar, I'd really like to really congratulate and to thank deeply all of our speakers and panelists for their excellent presentations. And I know, different times made it difficult for you to participate somehow, but you did. So we're so grateful that you did. You've certainly provided us with a deep, insightful and expert analysis of this US-China relations and its implications for Oceania, our part of the world. We come away from this webinar much enriched and more knowledgeable of this important topic, thanks to you. Thank you also to all of our viewers for your interest and for your support, also of the technical staff which made this webinar possible. And we invite you to look out for future webinars of UPF Peace Talk series, and they'll be putting on, and I'd also like to put out a special invitation to all of you, to your friends and to your colleagues, to an upcoming event, a very important event for us. It's August the 9th, Rally of Hope. This will be an online extravaganza employing the latest technology of Beyond Live and augmented reality, with the worldwide audience of over 1 million viewers expected. The theme will be towards rebuilding and renewing global society in the post-COVID-19 world, interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. So current heads of government will speak, as well as the UPF co-founder, Mother Moon. There will also be some very special entertainment, which we'll all enjoy. So don't miss it. So once again, thank you all. We wish you a very enjoyable rest of the weekend, and we thank you for participating. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Greg.
Nice to meet you all. Hope to catch up in person sometime with those that I haven't met.
Look forward to that.
Thank you.